Yeah, I think you need.
See, I think this is a very important question, at least to open up. We should have classes on what Michelle is raising. To go back to the history, the facts are that as 1919, there was no differences between what is now Stalin or Trotsky or... Actually, the founding members, when the Communist Party was formed, was William Z. Forster, who later became the leader of the Communist Party, and James Cannon, who became the leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, and they stayed together under the witch hunt of the worse than under the Palmer raids than what's his name, Ashcroft today, that forced them as a new grouping to go underground for 2 years, even though they had just formed a tendency. But there was no CP, there was no Trotskyists, there was no Stalin, altogether. They were Marxist-Leninists. And they believed in the Soviet Union. And they waited and traveled even to the Soviet Union to find out what Lenin and Zinoviev and Kamenev and some of the leaders who led the revolution, to understand the period that a revolution was made in a country, just blew the minds of any communists or progressives in this country. So the unity was there all the way up to 1925, when Lenin died. And a struggle developed over who would lead the Soviet Union. And in that struggle, Stalin won out and charged Trotsky, who had been under the will of Lenin to be the next leader in his will, was exiled, persecuted, and charged with his co-thinkers of being an agent of Nazi Germany and fascism. Then the question came up, well, what's going on? So here, in this country, Trotsky managed to get out a document. Nobody knew what was going on in this inner struggle in the Soviet Union that led to this big attack on what we call the left opposition. They were the left opposition to Stalin. And when that came out, all those in the party, including Sam Marcy, began to study this, get this document, and begin to read it and see that there was substance behind, there was a politics behind this frame-up. But they still stayed in the Communist Party. They did. I think Sam stayed in till 30s. Huh?
He stayed in until after Hitler had taken over in Germany.
Yeah.
Is that
32. See? Well, once that opened up, the question was, what should the left opposition do? The Soviet Union was in crisis. And so they stayed in all the way to 32, and then they were expelled because of being agents of Trotsky, who was an agent of Nazi Germany. It's incredible when you think of it today.
They claimed.
Yeah, right. So, starting with 1920, 1928, the CP here in this country began to take more and more of their loyalty was to Stalin. Forster and Earl Browder, who were the leaders, brought the Stalinist ideology here to this country. And what's most important that I thought of, even for this talk, was that the difference between Lenin and Trotsky, Lenin and Stalin, without going into the politics, which is for a class, a real class. But when Lenin wrote even this document that we use in this class, the left-wing communism and an infantile disorder, he wasn't dictating to the parties around the world. He was lending the experiences and the lessons of the revolution. See, and I thought to myself, the difference between Stalin, even put aside for a moment, was he was dictating for a leader in a country that was backward in terms of trying to elevate itself to an industrial power, difficult as it was against the U.S. and the other imperialist allies that were dead set on destroying the Soviet Union, whether it was Stalin or anybody. He did dictate that when he decided on a course of action, he expected the parties to respond in kind that could have had entirely different conditions in the countries such as the U.S. For example, 1925 wasn't particularly, it was the height of the golden insanity, as some of them say, about the wealth that was promulgating it. But he ordered the party here to go into what he called the Red Union developments, or the third, what he called the third part or something. And they did it because they were loyal to the Soviet Union. Forster and all the communist parties were loyal to the Soviet Union, and Stalin was the head of it. So they carried out the will. But the Trotskyists had, after they were expelled, had to begin a whole decade of explaining that they were for the Soviet Union, but this is what happened. See? And it had a hard road. I mean, even in Buffalo, Deidre could tell you stories. You had to have armed guards to have a meeting because the CP was so convinced we were fascists. It was an incredible period. And it was an unfortunate period in which the CP had a rich history of its own. William Forster was one of the great labor leaders, led the steel strikes of 1917, a brilliant organizer and tactician. And yet, here we were in a situation so that there's no question that we were defending the Soviet Union, but that we were supporting Leon Trotsky, that what was happening to him and his documents had to be defended. And that led to where there's confusion, and I'll end on this because it needs a class. There's confusion about who we are. And one of the reasons, just barely one of them, is that we were the most passionate supporters of the Soviet Union and the nationalized properties, the collectivizing of the land, the monopoly of foreign trade, all the developments that came out of the richness of the Soviet Union, plus all the social benefits that were accrued with the end of corporations and Wall Street and imperialism, we were identified with Stalin. So we're called Stalinists by some forces that are totally unaware of our history, based upon what I think is one fact. The second fact, and I'll end on this, is that those who claim to be Trotskyists began to weaken under the power of U.S. imperialism. And the Socialist Workers' Party that we were once a part of began to accommodate, along with others, to imperialism. Not that they were the mouthpieces of it, but they were adjusting their ideology, such as what happened in the Korean War, the Chinese Revolution. And that was a big factor, see. So that being identified as a Trotskyist by some would be identifying with that development that we split over, finally, in 1959. But there were more reasons for it, and we even tried during the Cold War our tendency to reach out to the CP because they were under the gun by the Smith Act that was passed, and the Cold War and the McCarthy period was directed against the Communist Party. The Rosenbergs were murdered and framed. We supported the Rosenbergs. So our history had an element of, you must be Stalinist. See, the movement got so fragmented in the years since the splits of the 40s and before that, that the confusion is incredible. And what I thought was a discussion for a class is based upon new people coming around that have to understand and get clarity about who's who, a scorecard of what's what the movements were all about, because today it's a mishmash. And young people who just want to struggle come to, well, why don't you all work together? I mean, it's a natural feeling. But if you go into the history of all these developments, they will learn, young people will learn how to make choices, how to decide where do they fit in this new upsurge that we see developing. And stop using labels for openness. Labels don't do it. History is not made up of labels. It's made up of struggles. It's made up of consistencies, programs, theory, practice. So the first thing you want to say is hold up the labels. That's
Thank you.